Hey, what's going on, you guys? It's ASI. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of our off video type thing. So a couple weeks ago, some people suggested that since I have so many other videos other than these main long series, like for instance, I've done long series on Alexander the Great, I've done the Napoleon series, Napoleon's Marshals, I'm working on Rome, and these are 20, 30 video series, sometimes longer. So every couple days of doing those, I take a break and I do 1 or 2 days of videos that people want to see. Now I have a long list, I promise you. If you've requested videos, if it's been like 2 weeks, hit me up again. Maybe I didn't write it down, but I bet you I did. I've got a long list. I mean, I've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, I've got the rise and fall of Germany, I've got Dutch Wars of Independence, I've got the Red Scare, I've got all kinds of stuff. I'm reading the list right now. That being said, today and tomorrow we're going to jump into the Apollo program. So for those of you that don't know, man, this was space. The Apollo 11, first man on the moon. We're talking Neil Armstrong, we're talking Buzz Aldrin, and of course the third guy that nobody can ever remember because he had to stay up in the orbiter. Anyway, yeah, we're going to be watching the Apollo program, part 1 and 2, from Epic History TVs. So hope you guys enjoy it. I'm really excited for this because I love space, I love planes, I love everything aviation, and I love their history. So I'm really excited to learn more about it. Before we get started, if you guys haven't subbed, hit that sub button, help me out. I really appreciate it. And, I'll owe you one, I promise. All right. Oh, and before we get started, James J., I hear you, man. You've suggested a few different a few different videos, and I promise I will get to them. All right. Anyway, let's get started on part 1.
1961, at the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space.
That's huge for the USSR.
Just weeks later, the United States launched its first astronaut, Alan Shepard.
I think it just said he was on Mercury 3, but I'm not sure. I'm sure they'll explain it, but I know that the Mercury program came first. Apollo program was of the American programs. Apollo program I think was third, and Gemini was in between, I think.
All systems are go.
He was welcomed home as a hero, but President John F. Kennedy knew that if the United States was to overtake the Soviet space program, it needed a bolder mission.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
That's such a huge moment in history.
As Kennedy addressed Congress, the United States had just 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. No one knew if a moon landing was even possible, let alone in just 9 years. It would be an unprecedented engineering and scientific undertaking, marked by heroism and tragedy. The incredible task of landing an astronaut on the moon would be known as the Apollo program.
For those of you that know a little bit about history, isn't he the Greek, I don't know if he's a Greek god or what, but isn't he the one that flew too close to the sun and had feathers with wax stuck to him so he could fly, and it melted and he fell back down to Earth or something?
Before NASA could start designing a spacecraft for its lunar mission, it faced some fundamental questions about how it would send astronauts to the moon. Perhaps the man best placed to provide answers was NASA's top rocket scientist, Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had spearheaded development of Nazi Germany's deadly V-2 rocket during World War II. It was the world's first long-range guided missile.
Wow.
After the war, he'd been recruited by the US military to assist their own rocket program.
After the war, a lot of World War II Germans were recruited by the US. Seriously, a lot of them. And the USSR.
He joined NASA as the first director of its Marshall Space Flight Center in 1960. The most obvious way to complete a lunar landing was to send a single spacecraft from Earth to the Moon and back again. But a spacecraft large enough to carry all the necessary supplies, equipment and fuel for the journey would need an impossibly huge rocket to launch into space. Von Braun wanted to solve this problem by launching the spacecraft in pieces aboard smaller rockets and assembling it in orbit around Earth. But there was still the problem of landing such a massive spacecraft on the Moon's surface. NASA engineer John Hobolt suggested another option, one initially considered far too dangerous by NASA's most senior engineers. Not one, but two spacecraft would travel to the Moon, joined together. The first was a Command and Service Module, or CSM. It would provide fuel, power, supplies and living space for 3 astronauts as they travelled to and from the Moon. The second spacecraft, the Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM, would land on the Moon. It would be piloted by 2 astronauts, whilst the third stayed behind to fly the CSM.
Right, okay.
Because the LEM only needed equipment and fuel for a lunar landing, it could be small and light. The huge savings in weight meant this spacecraft could be launched on one smaller rocket. Von Braun endorsed Hobolt's proposal, but the plan was high risk. To dock and undock the 2 spacecraft, NASA would need to invent new piloting techniques and execute them flawlessly, because if anything went wrong, the astronauts would have no hope of rescue.
Sorry about that, you guys. One thing that I do want to point out is think about back in the day. At this time, a lot of people are probably thinking, what about computers, you know? Well, in 1961, 1962, 63, all that jazz, you know, I mean, what was a computer? A computer was a team of software and computer engineers working together in a giant room filled with servers and just all kinds of stuff, and it was a computer room. It wasn't like a portable computer. I mean, nowadays I've got this, and this alone, just my phone, has more technology than the entire lunar module. It's insane just how far we've come, you know?
NASA embarked on years of pioneering research and development. The space flights of Project Mercury and Project Gemini paved the way for Apollo.
Yep.
Over 16 crewed missions in just 5 years, American astronauts learned how to eat, sleep, work, and walk in space. But President Kennedy didn't live to see these achievements. He was assassinated in
11/22/63 is when he was shot.
1963.
Yep.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace.
Check that out. I didn't know that. I assumed that Apollo 11 was Neil Armstrong's first flight, but he was on Gemini 8. Interesting.
There. And therefore, as we set sail...
Oh! Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin. Jesus, they've all been on stuff before. Mike Collins, I'm pretty sure, now that I see the name, I'm pretty sure that's the third name of the Apollo 11. The guy that had to stay up, right? And then, of course, Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon, and, of course, as very few people know, first man to pee on the moon. He talked about that years later in his spacesuit.
We ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
But before the Apollo program launched its first astronauts, it would face its darkest hour. This video is sponsored by Curiosity.
Sorry about that, you guys.
Stream.
There we go. So Apollo 1. Oh, this was... So I don't know much about Apollo 2, 3, 4, 5, 6... think 7 was the first one in space. Maybe it was 9. But I don't know about a number of those. But Apollo 11, I do know the tragedy that happened for sure.
Hey, how are we gonna get to the moon? We can't talk between 3 buildings. I can't hear that thing you're saying. Jesus Christ.
The Apollo 1 crew were sealed inside their command module, conducting a dress rehearsal of the launch countdown. The test had been halted by constant communications problems, and command pilot Gus Grissom was becoming frustrated. Grissom was one of America's most experienced astronauts. He was a member of NASA's first astronaut group, the Mercury 7, who launched into space aboard tiny one-person capsules. His senior pilot was Ed White, the first American to walk in space.
That's cool.
With them was rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, a former spy plane pilot who flew reconnaissance missions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Under enormous pressure to land an astronaut on the moon by the end of the decade, NASA and its contractors had rushed the design of the complex Apollo spacecraft. Even after 5 years of development and testing, it was still riddled with defects. During ground tests, astronauts struggled with coolant leaks, problems with the plumbing in the environmental system, and short circuits in the 20 miles of electrical wiring that filled the spacecraft. The crew were getting ready to resume the countdown.
Hey! Oh, it's got a fire in the cockpit. Did you get a lot of this? Buzz, did you read it?
Within moments, flames ripped through the capsule, killing all 3 astronauts. Precisely
Jesus
how the
Christ.
fire started was never determined.
It had to have been some type of a short or something. Jesus Christ, could you imagine? Burning alive has to be one of the absolute worst ways.
It was most likely a spark from damaged wiring, somewhere in the lower equipment bay. The atmosphere inside the command module was pure oxygen, and in this environment, even materials that were normally fire-resistant burst into flame. Within seconds, the spacecraft became an incinerator.
Yeah. Wow.
The design of the spacecraft's heavy, multi-piece hatch made escape impossible. The inner hatch was fixed in place with 6 large bolts, which had to be manually unscrewed with a wrench. Even if the bolts could have been removed in time, the hatch opened inwards, and so it was sealed shut by the high pressure inside the capsule.
Oh, wow.
The risks of spaceflight were well understood at NASA, but Grissom, White, and Chaffee did not die during a rocket launch or in orbit. They died on the ground during a routine test with help close at hand.
Wow.
The tragedy of Apollo 1 left NASA's public image in tatters. If the Apollo program was to survive, the next mission had to be a success. After a series of uncrewed test flights, the next mission to carry astronauts would be Apollo 7.
Okay, so yeah, that's why I don't know much about Apollo 2 through 6, is because they didn't carry anybody. They were probably just testing, testing takeoff, testing, I don't know, different things like that, maybe approach, landing, I have no idea. So 7, okay.
Learning from the failures that caused the Apollo 1 fire, NASA redesigned the Apollo spacecraft. The new Block 2 model had fireproof wiring and spacesuits made with non-flammable cloth. At launch, the capsule was pressurized with a safer oxygen-nitrogen mix, and its new single-piece hatch
60-40. That's still pretty high in oxygen, but I guess it can't just burst into massive flames.
could be opened in just 7 seconds. The lunar module was still in the design phase and would be tested on later flights. The Apollo 7 crew had been the Apollo 1 backups. Like Gus Grissom, mission commander Wally Schirra had been part of the original Mercury 7 astronaut corps. Their mission was to give the new Apollo spacecraft a thorough shakedown.
5, 4, 3, 2, we have ignition. Commit, liftoff.
Wow.
We have liftoff.
Schirra and his crew put the Apollo spacecraft through its paces for the first time.
Could you imagine even just, I know probably several of you watching were there, but could you imagine just watching it on TV for the first time? Any type of footage like this? I mean, it was probably black and white at the time, 1967, but it's incredible. And then imagine being in there and just, I can't even imagine what it'd feel like to go to space. I would love to go to space at some point in my life, but I don't know if it'll ever happen, you know? I mean, I'm pushing 30 now, so I have, what, 50 years left in me? We'll see.
They performed navigation exercises and practiced docking maneuvers, using their spent rocket booster as a target. Apollo 7 accomplished all its objectives. The mission was a success. The Apollo program was back on track. And its next step would truly be a giant leap.
Ah, he said it. Apollo 8. There was probably one chance in 3 that we wouldn't make it back. I see. Yeah. So they slingshot around the moon, or was no? That was more of an Apollo 13,
In April
right?
1968, a CIA report suggested that the Soviet Union was about to send cosmonauts around the moon. To stop the Soviets beating America to another first, Apollo 8, originally intended as a test of the lunar module in Earth orbit, would instead be sent on a mission to orbit the moon.
Wow.
The furthest any human had traveled from the surface of the Earth was 850 miles. Apollo 8's crew would travel 240,000 miles from home, with no hope of rescue if their spacecraft failed.
Wow.
The mission
That had to be terrifying, but just amazing, you know?
commander was Frank Borman, an Air Force colonel, test pilot and aeronautical engineer. His command module pilot was Jim Lovell, who knew Borman better than most. On Gemini 7, the two men spent a record-breaking and grueling 14 days orbiting the Earth in a tiny spacecraft.
Wow.
Joining them was Bill Anders. His job would be to survey the moon's surface for future landing sites. Traveling to the moon required the largest rocket NASA had ever designed. Borman, Lovell and Anders would be the first astronauts to ride the mighty Saturn V.
We have commit, we have liftoff.
At over 110 meters tall, it dwarfed all previous American rockets.
Wow.
Its 5 enormous F-1 engines burned through 500,000 gallons of kerosene and liquid oxygen in just 2.5 minutes, delivering a combined thrust of 7.5 million pounds.
Jesus.
Second and third stages carried the spacecraft to Earth orbit and onwards to the moon.
How cool is it that, I didn't want to cut him off mid-sentence, but when they showed Kennedy Space Center, they showed a big flat platform moving the rocket over. They still use those type of things with like all the space shuttle programs, you know? They use that same flat runway to get from one place to the other. It's just cool how much hasn't changed after all this time. And god dang, that is a big rocket.
It took the Apollo 8 crew 3 days to travel to the moon. But they did not fly alone. Like all Apollo missions, Apollo 8 was carefully managed from the Mission Operations Control Room in Houston, Texas, popularly known as Mission Control. Teams of flight controllers operated round the clock, overseeing the spacecraft's trajectory and every one of its onboard systems. All voice communication.
Whoa. Oh, I guess it makes sense for them to have a surgeon. That's just not one of the ones that I thought would be in mission control, but I guess it makes absolute sense, you know?
To the spacecraft passed through the Capsule Communicator, or Capcom, a position always filled by a fellow astronaut. The flight
Huh.
director...
Hang on, did that just say Michael Collins? It did. Very interesting. Mike Collins was the, I keep on thinking that's the third guy on Apollo 11.
A position always filled by a fellow astronaut. The flight director had overall responsibility for the mission, and the final say in every decision. When Apollo 8 reached the moon, the crew had to fire their large SPS engine to slow down and be captured by the moon's gravity. If the engine didn't fire for precisely the correct amount of time, Apollo 8 could crash into the moon or be hurled into deep space. It was impossible to communicate with the crew whilst they were behind the moon.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
The staff at Mission Control waited nervously for news.
Imagine how nervous you had to be in that room. They disappear behind the moon, you can't hear anything. And then you're just waiting and you're waiting, and then they just say, hey, yeah, what's up? What's going on? Can you hear us? You know, Mission Control, do you read?
Apollo 8, Houston, over.
There it is.
Go ahead, Houston, Apollo 8.
Right, we've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit.
Borman, Lovell and Anders were the first humans to view the lunar surface close up. But the most incredible thing they saw was their home planet. On the third orbit, Anders captured one of history's most remarkable photos.
It's an extremely famous photo. Seriously, I didn't know that this was from the Apollo 8 trip, though. That's really cool.
Earthrise. The image was peaceful, but 1968 had been a difficult year for the United States. The nation was bitterly divided over the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Black Americans were still fighting for their civil rights. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April, and Bobby Kennedy in June. But for NASA, at least, the success of Apollo 8 brought hope. For the first time, it seemed possible they might meet President Kennedy's goal and land an astronaut on the moon before the end of the decade. But the lunar module was still untested, and landing on the moon held many unknowns.
Hey, maybe somebody could answer this for me. They just mentioned, so we know JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. We know that his brother Bobby was assassinated in 68, and MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated in 68 as well, at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. Or Lorraine Motel. I'm not sure if it's a motel or a hotel. If you guys haven't checked out, by the way, if you're ever in the Memphis area, it is now a National Civil Rights Museum, and it's amazing. Seriously, you got to stop in there. That being said, though, when did JFK Jr. get shot? Or not, sorry, get shot. I apologize. When did, his plane crashed, right? Was that the next year? Was that 69, or was that also 68? Because I know it was close to when his Uncle Bobby died.
There would be no room for error.
Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Can say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
No, that's not the end. Oh, god dang it. That's a cliffhanger. He didn't... It kind of irritates me. Epic History TV didn't leave me any cliffhangers when I was watching the Napoleon series. I mean, they left me little ones, but nothing crazy like that. I think the Apollo 8 comes back and lands. Because they didn't just transmit that photo. So it makes sense they came back and landed. I just... yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I guess stick around tomorrow and we'll do the second part of this series. I'm really excited because I guess it will show what happens to the Apollo 8. The 9, 10, of course the famous 11. We know what happened with the 13 because they made a whole movie about it. And the Apollo series, I think, went all the way to 17. I think it was 11, 12. So 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Yeah, 6 times 3. 18 astronauts went to the moon. I guess actually 12 landed on the moon because it was 2 every time. Anyway, hope you guys stick around till next time. This is Ace. I'm out.